היי, שלום לכולם. סתם רציתי לראות עוד פעם כמה תלמידים במדינה, כזה, שנה א' וזה, אבל הם לא רצו לפעמים. לא, לא. אמרתי, quality, not quantity, שיש פה. אז אני ממש שמחה שבכל זאת באתם, ושאולי מישהו יראה את זה אחר כך בבית, ואולי יבוא בהמשך. ואני פשוט אעבור עכשיו לאנגלית, כי יש לנו שני אורחים, שבאמת זאת הזדמנות כל כך טובה לשמוע עוד אנשים שמדברים על המלחמה והשורשים שלה, ובעיקר מה יקרה הלאה. ולכן רצינו ממש לנצל את ההזדמנות שמבקרת כאן לעשות את המפגש הזה. So I'm switching to English. Okay. So I'm very, very happy to have with us here two rising stars in the field of international relations, diplomatic history. Okay? That's good.
If you say so.
I say so, yeah. Okay, so we have with us Professor Simon Miles. I'm going to read just to know so you don't know.
Okay, sure.
Okay? Yeah. Okay, rewind, just a second. The moderator, the reason I'm a little confused is that the moderator of our conversation today was supposed to be Dr. Orbinovich. Always coming, but there was a big accident on Route 6. The road was closed. She had to find all sorts of creative ways to reach Jerusalem. So she's going to get here, but she's going to get here a little late, so I'm taking over for now. When she comes, she can join us and ask some smart questions. Okay. Okay. So I'm very happy to have with us Professor Simon Miles and Professor Susan Colbourn from Duke University, Stanford Public Policy School. Okay, I'll start with you, okay? I'm not good at this, okay? So Simon is a faculty member of the Stanford School of Public Policy in, so it's part of Duke University?
Yes.
Okay. And he's written two really, really interesting and pertinent books to our conversation today. The first book is called Engaging the Evil Empire, Washington, Moscow, and the Beginning of the End of the Cold War, which explores the root causes of cooperation between two adversarial states, the US and the Soviet Union, to situate the peaceful conclusion of the Cold War in a broader international context. Needless to say how relevant this is today for thinking about the future, okay? And the second book, which I found even more intriguing in terms of things I really know nothing about, I know very little about, is called On Guard for Peace and Socialism, the Warsaw Pact, 1955-1991. And that book examines the ways in which members of the Warsaw Pact conceived of and provided for their own security in the nuclear age. And I'm stressing this because, and I've already sort of went on this before, my sense is that when we're talking about, the future of Europe today, future of NATO, the role of Eastern European states is so important and so central, and still we get sort of caught up in just focusing on the US and on Russia. So having here someone who actually sort of looked through this more extensively at a period where we believe they had even less agency, that is during the Cold War and the Warsaw Pact, where no one talked about, what the Poles wanted because it was the Soviet Union. I think that's really, really interesting. So that's okay. I'll stop with that with Simon, and I'll just move on to our next participant. Susan is. I'm reading, this is what you wrote, so if you're not happy, it's on you. Susan is a diplomatic and international historian working on issues of security and strategy since 1945. She specializes in transatlantic relations and the history of NATO, and she's the associate director of the Triangle Institute for Security Studies, based at Stanford School of Public Policy at Duke University. And she is the author of Euro Missiles, the nuclear weapons that nearly destroyed NATO, and who knows what's going to happen to them next. And this book is it out?
Coming out in November.
Okay. So
available for pre-order.
So next you come for a book launch. Okay. So again, needless to say, both NATO and this nuclear element are extremely relevant when we're talking about events still unfolding in Ukraine these days. So we're like 3 months after this war started, and some of that tension is sort of waning down in the news. You can see this here, where at the beginning every day there was something about the Ukraine. Every respectable institution had to say something about the Ukraine, or it's like they're not relevant to the world. And I think there's less interest, but as the issue is as important as it has ever been, and I think where eyes are now more towards the future and not just on-the-ground conflict management, on-the-ground refugees crisis. These are all still issues, but I think we can start thinking more strategically ahead. So I'm very, very happy that both of you were willing to come and talk to us. We're thinking of all sorts of questions. We are a small forum, so we can do this informally, and I thought of starting, okay, so I already warned Simon. The way I thought of starting is that each one of you can say a few words about your own work, and then say something about how you think this sort of then reflects on how you view current events and in the future. And we'll navigate from there. And they're very cool. They will speak about anything, so you can ask anything. Everything is like, cool, sure.
I mean, wicked and I don't know, but that's okay.
Thank you.
Sure. So I professionally wear 2 hats. Of course, on the one hand, do you want me to have that?
Yeah.
All right. Is this okay? Yeah? Okay. All right. I'll hold this thing. I'm just going to hold it in my hand though. So I professionally sort of wear 2 hats. The bigger of the 2 hats is, of course, I teach history at a school of public policy, which is something that more and more policy schools in the United States are starting to do, which is hire PhD historians, because there's a sense that perhaps we have faced some of these challenges before, and that perhaps something could be learned from them. My own sort of niche is Eastern European and Soviet history. I spend a lot of time, probably more time than is healthy, in various dusty old Soviet and Eastern European archives, probably inhaling a quantity of asbestos, which I will regret later in life, but for the time being, it could be worse. And so my interest in Russia, the Soviet Union, Eastern Bloc comes from family history on both sides, but especially on my mother's side. And I grew up speaking Slovak in the house with her at a young age. And so there is just kind of a crass comparative advantage story to be told here. But it also was a great interest to me. The other hat that I wear is I do consulting work for a very small portion of the US military, which has a very large amount to do with Russia. And that's been a large part of my professional life for the last several years. And so, of course, this segment was having a lot to do with Russians in various parts of the world, and we're trying to kind of get to the bottom of why, and to better educate their, especially their kind of senior non-commissioned corps cadres as to what was happening and why it was happening. So this kind of intersects with both lines, because on the one hand, I've been very interested in, of course, in my second book, which is forthcoming at a date as yet to be determined. Thank you, yes, thank you, and the reviews are already great. I tell these stories about Soviet invasions of Hungary in '56, the Warsaw Pact invasion of Czechoslovakia in '68, of course the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in the 1980s, starts in '79. So this is kind of of interest to me, both historically and also in a very contemporary way. And I think one thing that we're seeing, and this is the last point I'll make before I pass the mic to Susan, is that there are recurring patterns in how the Russian state thinks about the use of force, how it prepares for and doesn't prepare for the use of force, and the consequences that has for battlefield effectiveness, and also in the motivators and drivers of Russian external policy. a sense that is driven by the Russian sense of history, the Russian sense of geography, Professor Rabinovich, the Russian sense of geography, and what the wider world has in store for them.
Yeah, so I focus on the other half of Europe. I am by training a historian of NATO, interested in the search for security in the post-1945 world. So the book I have coming out in the fall is a story about the rise and fall of an arms race centered in Europe between the United States and the Soviet Union over what were called at the time the Euro missiles, but variously known as theater nuclear forces or the intermediate range nuclear forces, the weapons that were done away with by Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev in the 1987 INF Treaty, right? These were weapons that could strike the capitals of Europe, both east and west, from the various sides of the Iron Curtain. And so with that behind me, the work that I'm starting on now is twofold, but really about European security and the effort to build a new Europe in the 1990s. So right now, I'm just in the research phase of a short book mapping the public debate about NATO enlargement from 1989 to the present. So Sweden and Finland have given me, now I have to rethink the entire order of the book that I proposed and how I will divide my chapters, but such is the beauty of writing about very contemporary history. But basically the idea was that sitting in the United States in particular, a lot of the conversation revolves around the United States, as though NATO enlargement is something that Washington decides it wants to do, and then NATO enlarges because NATO is Washington's organization. And it's just not true. And maybe it's because I'm Canadian originally, but I really don't like these narratives that it's all about the United States, that the United States is the central driving force. So the idea behind the book is to map the debate, both in civil society, but also among members of the alliance and the aspiring members about why NATO should grow, what the potential dangers of NATO growing are, things that are maybe relevant today if you're opening the newspaper and seeing how, say, Vladimir Putin has responded to, well, I don't know, anything in the last 3 months, basically. So I'll leave it there as a starter.
You missed the second half of the question.
What was the second half of the question?
The relevance to.
Okay,
no, but okay. So let's try to take this to. I think I'm going back and forth on whether we should rediscuss the origins of the conflict or just think more towards the future. And the two, I assume, are sort of combined. But I would want to ask, since we started with. Okay, we'll start with NATO. Okay. NATO enlargement seems to be like a key issue here, both in the causes and in the consequences of the war. And I'm wondering what your take is on both sides of this. So, both of you. So one is like the John Mersheimer, Steve Walt, very, very clear argument that we're in this mess because of NATO enlargement, the U.S., its American hubris, and offensive realist tendencies. Sort of there's an internal contradiction in this argument.
Yeah.
But the
because
argument,
a realist would enlarge NATO. A realist should enlarge NATO at the expense of
basically says the
Russia.
world is the world should be defensive realist, but it is offensive, and the Americans are actually proving this, and it's not working. But okay, sorry, my intro to IR thing sort of popped up. The point is that they make a very clear argument. I think all this, defensive realists make the argument that we would not have been in this situation had the U.S. not continuously provoked Russia by expanding closer to its border. Everyone brings the example of, Mexico, and if, you had Chinese bases in Mexico, the U.S. would be as concerned. So that's like one side of the story, whether you think, how big is this part of the story? The NATO enlargement, provoking Russia and leading to the war. And then the second half of the question is like the consequences, and the issue of NATO enlargement is clearly on the table now. with Finland, and with Sweden, and that raises again all sorts of questions, both related to Russia, provoking Russia or deterring Russia, two sides of the dilemma, but also intra-European, intra-NATO divides. Turkey suddenly reminding us that, hey, we're here. The Americans can't just decide they want to bring Sweden in. So there are two sides, big sides to the story, before the war and consequences for NATO after the war. And we'll do the nuclear stuff afterwards.
Yeah.
Yeah, so on the first piece of the puzzle, I promise I won't forget the second half of the question, but on the first piece, right, of how much NATO enlargement is part of why the war is happening, I'm deeply skeptical of this argument. Yes, Vladimir Putin has said that that's why. I'm going to go out on a limb and suggest that it's not implausible to believe that Vladimir Putin has a good spin guy, and that Vladimir Putin might tell you things that aren't true. Right? Some things are convenient pretexts, they make for good arguments. It doesn't mean that that's why you actually go out and do them. It seems to me that I'm not under any illusions, right? I don't think Vladimir Putin likes NATO enlargement. I don't think he likes any of the rounds of NATO enlargement. And one of the problems with rebutting or disaggregating this argument is that we refer kind of to NATO enlargement as this thing, as though it was one moment fixed in time. But you're talking about a process that has had numerous rounds, that's involving numerous different countries with numerous different geopolitical contexts. I mean, 1952, Greece and Turkey is not, are Georgia and Ukraine going to join in 2008 and the Budapest conversation, right? So NATO enlargement is kind of a coverall term that lots of people use, but they're not all defining it to mean the same thing. In terms of why it seems to me, what is motivating the war, it seems fairly clear that Putin's central objection is to the existence of a free and independent Ukraine. Right? It is about a Ukraine that wants to look to the West, to the European Union, to NATO, to integrate into Western institutions, that wants to look away from what Putin and many of his close advisors would refer to as the so-called Russian world. And so it's not that the story is so cut and dry that you can say, oh, NATO and the European Union aren't part of the calculus in the Kremlin at all, but I don't think NATO enlargement is the issue. The issue is about the future orientation of Ukraine and what that means for Putin and the future of Russia at home. In terms of the second half of the question, right, where NATO enlargement fits in where we're going, the obvious answer is Sweden and Finland, right, have expressed interest in joining, and I don't think we can underscore that how much of a change this is. At one level, Sweden and Finland have had fairly consistent cooperation and active engagement with NATO since the 1990s, participating in exercises, exchanging information, but the decision to leave behind, in the case of Finland, decades of a tradition of military non-alignment, in the case of Sweden, centuries dating back to the Napoleonic Wars to 1814, that is a big change. And just in terms of the geographic map of Europe, the geopolitical and geostrategic landscape there, if Sweden and Finland are successful in joining NATO, that will double the border that NATO shares with Russia. And so it changes the calculus around the Baltic Sea, makes Kaliningrad big nightmare for any Russian planner. So there's a lot at play there that is really difficult. I think in terms of Turkey, and to a lesser extent Hungary is kind of also interested in playing this spoiler role in NATO. I don't think, I'm a historian, I don't like to make forecasts about the future, but I don't think the prospects are high that Turkey is successful in stopping Finland or Sweden. I think this is really about bargaining and maneuvering, trying to extract a few concessions that are helpful to Erdogan, particularly at home, looking at an election in the future and all of these kinds of things. But it does come at a cost. The bluster is a good reminder to many allies, but also just to many voters in allied countries that Turkey is not the greatest ally, and that there are many voters who don't feel positively about having Turkey be in the alliance. So I know a fairly influential former US Senator, Joe Lieberman, right, wrote a piece a couple days ago, and basically the core of the piece is, why is Turkey in NATO? Let's figure out how to kick them out. And that's really complicated because the designers of the North Atlantic Treaty, despite debating ways that they might kick an ally out, they never actually agreed to a mechanism, and so that never made it into the treaty. But the fact that you have high-profile news outlets in the United States willing to run those kinds of stories tells you a little bit about how much the Turkish government is going out on a limb here in the public opinion sense by trying to maybe overplay or play a pretty strong hand that might not turn out to be strong in the long term.
So let me make two really quick points. The first has to do with NATO expansion, and so unequivocally, I think Mearsheimer, Wall, Posen, etc. are wrong, and that is sort of the superficial point. But I think there's kind of a bigger point that deserves mentioning. I think this is a problem. It's an acute problem, actually, in the American study of international relations, which is that for better or for worse, I think there is an unfortunate tendency to place the United States at the center of events. And the way that you place the United States at the center of events in the case of a war between Russia and Ukraine is you, one, espouse the view that the United States is the only country that kind of expanded NATO. Look, during the 1990s, you could not walk down a hall in the Pentagon without tripping over a Polish colonel who was there to tell you how wonderful Poland's military was and how ready they were to integrate. Ditto with Czechs, ditto with Hungarians. NATO expansion, and I'm working very specifically on this in those three states as well as Romania right now, as I read up the last chapter of my recently published book.
Time travel.
They were adamant. The Hungarians basically decided in 1989 that they are going to join NATO. In 1990, it's official government policy. It's the directive sent out to diplomats. We're joining NATO. They were in the Warsaw Pact until mid-1991. So the story of this is being driven by the United States. Well, of course, there were supporters of this in the United States, and it's certainly fair to say that it would not have happened over the objections of the Clinton administration, which did not object. I think that those folks see only part of the story, and thus they're putting the agency in the hands, in this case, of a country which is not really party to this struggle. The second point that I want to make is that the roots of Vladimir Putin's antipathy for Ukraine are, of course, that he believes that they are the same country, right? He believes that there's no meaningful difference between Russians and Ukrainians and Russia and Ukraine. But then you have a little problem if you're VVP, which is, his claim is that a country like Russia can only be led by an autocrat like him. And make no mistake about it, if you watch Russian state TV, which I do, which is not something I can recommend to anyone, they're not hiding their system, right? When there are accusations that Russia's an autocracy, no one's getting up on Pervy Canal and saying, no, we're a beautiful, flourishing democracy. They say, no, yes, we are a managed democracy, is the Russian term of art, because we need to be, because the only way this state can work is through managed democracy. Well, but if Ukraine can be a functional liberal democracy that is economically integrated with the West, then why can't Russia? There is no good answer to that other than because Vladimir Putin finds it much more advantageous for it to work like this. And in Russian, the Russian political system, corruption is not a feature of the system, I guess we would say a bug of the system. It is the system. That's how it works. Resource extraction, redirection of wealth. So it's an existential threat for him. You know, this kind of flourishing, thriving, liberal, democratic Ukraine, which was a work in progress, don't get me wrong. It's an existential threat to his position at the head of the country, and I'm absolutely certain that Vladimir Putin believes that the day that he is no longer the president of the Russian Federation is the day that he stops breathing.
Wow, so many quick follow-up questions. Okay, so but just to clarify the last point, so what you're saying is this is really an identity threat, or should I say, Dr. Yoni Avomson is here, so an ontological security
Absolutely.
threat. Okay.
It's an existential threat. A flourishing Ukraine, I believe, is an existential threat to Vladimir Putin. Therefore, because it's a highly personalist regime, it's an existential threat to the state.
Okay. Okay, I'm trying to think which way to go. There's so many ways to go. Okay. Okay, let's leave Russia aside for a second and get back to this later, but I think you made a very important point about how we tend to put the US in the center. Maybe you can say a bit more about the discrepancies in the interests of the Americans, the EU, and I would divide it would divide the EU into like the Western Europe and the states that actually need to worry physically about Russia, because when we tell the American story, but as you said very quietly, the Americans are the ones not there. They're the ones who clearly set the stage from the outset by saying we're not sending forces. So we're going to do all sorts of impressive other things, but this will not be a war with U.S. forces on the ground. So how much? I would ask this in two ways. Okay, what are the differences in the interests of these different the Americans, the Western Europeans, and the Eastern Europeans in terms of how they want this to play out? And from what you know, and since you're also advising, this is bad. How much of who's setting the tone? I mean, in terms of the ongoing interactions and consultations, are the Americans really setting the tone here, or really sort of taking a step back and letting the EU leaders do the job? I'm curious if we know, who's, what's happening behind the scenes there. So diverging interests and who's actually making policy now.
So maybe I'll start with the second question and take the first, if I may, because I think that'll flow better. At the beginning of all of this, the number one goal of the Biden administration was to make it go away. No one who walked into the West Wing or the Eisenhower Executive Office building or the National Security Council has its physical offices did so wanting to talk about Russia. The goal was basically, and I'm using the term of art that was coined by a Biden political appointee, was to park Russia and deal with China. China was the big question. It was the long-range threat, and also was where sort of the space for innovation and policy entrepreneurship was perceived in the American context. And you can get this just by read the pages of Foreign Affairs, right? Until this war started, every single thing was about China or had a China hook. And then the Russia people came out of the woodwork. Interestingly, many of whom I did not know beforehand to have been Russia people or military analysts, but such is life when something gets hot. So the Biden administration kind of came around to this, I think, quite unwillingly in many ways. And that characterized the early phases of the kind of the left of boom of the conflict, with phase 0, where you were seeing, one, the rapid and significant declassification of intelligence to try to warn the Russians off, and 2, statements like that by the president that the United States would not commit ground forces, wouldn't become involved militarily, which, for the record, I think was a mistake. Because I think it's unwise to forswear, policy options before you actually see what the problem set is. I'm not suggesting that the United States should or would intervene militarily, but I do think that was emboldening of a certain category of Russian policymaker who wanted to hear exactly that. What they did not count on was the weapons. What they did not count on was Europe. So now I think what we're seeing is the age-old phenomenon that at the end of the day, money can buy you friends. Or, as is the case now, M777 howitzers can buy you friends. I don't recommend trying that to anyone whose social life is not what they wish it were, as I think that would probably get you on the list. But of course the United States, because it is providing such a significant quantity of armaments to the Ukrainians, has a very loud voice. But I think it is not nearly as outsized a role as it would be otherwise, because of the extremely proactive measures being taken by countries that we don't talk about a lot. Poland, the Czech Republic, Slovakia gave us 300 surface-to-air missiles. The Baltic states, Lithuania in particular, when the Polish president went and spoke to the Verkhovna Rada, the Ukrainian parliament, just the other day, his second visit to Kyiv, I think that was a clear demonstration of the fact that a lot of the countries that we think of as being acted upon, as opposed to acting, are actually acting. And in this case, are shaping a lot of the conversation. The reason for that is, I think, very easy to understand sitting here in Israel, which is that it's one thing for the United States to be willing to practice a pretty classic defense in depth on NATO terrain, to use space to buy time. But that's Polish space, and the Poles would rather not give up that space. The Lithuanians, and this is the specific Israel point, don't have the space to be in the business of giving it up. They need to defend forward. And that is really, I think, shaping a lot of the conversation. The last point I'll make on this is that in the US government, there has been an atrophying of Russia expertise. Because, of course, the global war on terror was what was hot and important. And then it was really China. And so in all sort of parts of government, the ambitious folks were not going into Russia. And I'll tell you, when I started getting my PhD in 2014, I was told not to do Russia. I was told Middle East, man, Soviet war in Afghanistan at least, because you've got the Russian language skills. That's where it's at. The whole Russia thing, just forget about that. That's not the way of the future. Times have changed. And then just to quickly touch on your second point, I think we have seen a very clear bifurcation between the east and the west of NATO and the east and the west of the European Union. And I think Susie will talk more about this, but I think that links back to that point I just made about space and time and whose space it is. This is an absolutely critical issue for these countries. It's the reason they're in NATO in the first place, right? They didn't get suckered into NATO by the United States in the 1990s. They wanted to join NATO because they perceived Russia as a security threat.
Yeah, there's so maybe over 15 years ago now, during the war in Iraq, Donald Rumsfeld made this famous remark about how there were two kinds of European allies that the US had. Right, there was the New Europe, so all the post-communist states that had been members of the Warsaw Pact and became members of NATO, starting with the Czech Republic and Poland and Hungary. And then there was the old Europe, so mostly France and Germany. And I think we're seeing, I don't very often favorably quote Donald Rumsfeld, but I think here we could see a very Rumsfeldian paradigm, right? That there is a very sharp division between the old Europe and the new Europe, and the fact that the strongest party of the old Europe on the war has been the United Kingdom, only reinforces that, right? So when you are talking about who are the movers and the shakers, and I mean this in all dimensions, right? So we talk a lot, and the news coverage focuses a lot on supplies, right? Who is sending howitzers, who is sending S-300s, who is sending, various missiles to, help the Ukrainians beat back as much of the Russian onslaught as they can. We talk a lot about that, about material, about artillery, that kind of stuff. But if you look also at who was spearheading sanctions, right? Who was on the diplomatic front? Who was even in the room starting to talk about the future of European security? Those conversations are not happening in Berlin. They are happening in Warsaw, right? And it's because the current situation is untenable. If you're Polish or Czech or Slovak, if you're Estonian, the current model is not going to work, right? They're starting to think this has changed the way that they were thinking, deepened, in many ways accelerated and deepened existing thinking. And so the idea is, it may be a long time before we're able to build something new, but we need to start talking about what that new thing might look like so that we're best positioned to do so. And I think the division between old and new Europe here is particularly critical because I think for most Central and Eastern European states, I think for the United Kingdom, I think even in the US and Canada, it's clear that France and Germany have long been the sort of central engine of European integration, of the European Union, that France and Germany aren't interested in going in a direction that is one that the Central and Eastern Europeans like. So you've seen an incredible amount of public criticism of German foreign policy, which, not to say that German foreign policy has ever been very popular across the continent. Usually economic diplomacy is where they get the most of the criticism, but the willingness to explicitly come out and say that Berlin is not willing to talk openly about security interests, whether they are German security interests or European security interests writ large. I mean, the Germans have really come under fire in a big way. I think Macron's diplomacy, well rooted in many positive instincts about wanting to keep the dialogue open, have also put the French in sort of the crosshairs in that when you make these sort of ambiguous statements about how maybe the best solution would be if Ukraine just gave up a little territory to keep Vladimir Putin happy and then there could be peace, well, needless to say, not everybody agrees with you that this is the solution for peace, and not everybody is enthusiastic about having an ally, right? If the Franco-German collaboration, that line, the connection between Berlin and Paris has so often been the foundation of European integration, well, maybe you're not so convinced that vision of Europe is one that has your security interests at heart if you were in Bratislava or Warsaw or wherever. So we're really starting to see, I don't think any of these fault lines are new, but they are deepening in ways that are going to be very hard to go back to the old structures. And so I don't think we're at a point where we're going to see a big breakup of any of the current constellations that we have that shape the institutions, that shape the European security landscape, but you are starting to see a renewed attention to sort of ad hoc frameworks, where people talk a lot about mini-lateralism as the sort of trendy terminology of art, but the idea that maybe the UK is a more reliable ally, that a security guarantee and cooperation with London is better than with Paris or with Berlin, and these will have ripple effects that I think change the way European security looks, even before we get to the big question of whether and how you engage Russia in a European security order, which is like a whole other can of worms that we can talk about.
It's a good can of worms. But also, a bit on this latter point, the divisions. It's intriguing because we actually hear much more about how NATO has become so, all the old divisions in NATO and divisions between the Europeans and the Americans and burden sharing and stuff like that. All this has miraculously disappeared, and NATO is now stronger than ever. But as you've clarified here, that actually the divisions are not just there, some of them are actually, the stakes are actually becoming higher. So I'm curious, do you think that France and Germany would actually be forced to change, given that the alliance is a multilateral alliance and is facing a clearer and present danger now than before? Do you think that within this internal bargaining, the French and the Germans will actually be sort of forced to do more in terms of a more aggressive line, I guess, vis-a-vis Russia? I mean, does this alliance today actually give more voice to these weaker newcomers to the Eastern European states, but the ones that have much more at stake and therefore are much more motivated to work also within the alliance or outside the alliance to maintain their security? So how, is this like an entrapment of the French and the Germans to actually sort of move up to a more sort of assertive policy? And we've seen the Germans, I mean, the Germans here have been, the Germans have, at least officially, made a very dramatic foreign policy shift, at least rhetorically. So there's a foot at the door to do more. So how much can they be pressured, I think, by the other states? And I guess, the million-dollar question is, what are the different options on the table for these states, both in terms of the final solution with the Ukraine, and the issue of Russia? They're both intertwined, of course. And we have the deterrence version on the one hand, the reassurance one.
Nuclear stuff in the nuclear stuff.
Okay, that's deterrence, reassurance, and then the next. Okay, I was trying to divide them. I'm looking at the watch now. You should come, if you come here, you can ask the nuclear question. Okay, so that's the. Oh, disturb me now. Okay. I will ask both questions, okay? One is that question about, which is more, I guess, political, in terms of future arrangements, both for Ukraine and for Russia, beyond the rhetoric. At the end of the day, something's going to happen there, and Russia won't disappear. So we have to deal with this. The second question, and I will put it on the table instead of waiting for the next round, is really I think some of the discussion here, and also the fact that the Americans did put on the table to begin with that they're not going to send ground forces, and you thought it was a mistake. Okay. Some of it, there are big strategic questions here, and then there are more sort of tactical questions of, crisis stability and the risk of escalation that's unintended. Clearly, no one wants it, but there's so many scenarios of an escalation. So these are almost two different questions that sometimes get sort of intertwined. And clearly the nuclear issue is the one that is the most troubling because of its potential consequences. So the second question has to do with crisis stability, the nuclear element, and do you think there is a real risk here of something really bad that all can talk about on TV for like 2 years now? Okay.
You want me to go first, and I can talk later?
You should really
Yeah, sure. So I guess the basic starting point I would make is that France and Germany are two very different countries insofar as their relationship with the alliance exists. So I don't think there's a lot of ways to pressure the French in the alliance context. They are more than happy. It serves the French domestic political landscape to be a little rogue in NATO. It's part of the French brand historically. In Germany, there is a lot more ability to place pressure on Germany. And I think you are seeing an incredibly difficult political moment in Germany, because really this has forced a number of policymakers and politicians to go back and visit first principles of how they engage with Europe, and particularly how they engage with Russia. And there has been, this is a place where if you look back at the Cold War, there is a really interesting narrative phenomenon that came out of the Cold War, which is that we think a lot about how there are different narratives in the West and the East about how the Cold War ended, right? So obviously Putin's narrative about what the end of the Cold War and what it did to the Soviet Union is a story of lament, of sadness, of loss of Russian power, a disdain for Mikhail Gorbachev in particular. We tend to think that there is like one narrative in the West. And another place where this sort of American-centric vision really takes center stage, we tend to think of it very triumphalist, right? Ronald Reagan builds up to build down, he talks tough, spends a lot of money, and then Mikhail Gorbachev is this wonderful man with whom he can do business. They walk in Red Square, it's beautiful, the Cold War is over, blah, 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 blah. The Germans have a very different, the West Germans in particular, I want to be clear, right, have a very different narrative about what won the Cold War. And they're the old logic of Ostpolitik, of engagement through trade, of constant diplomacy through tough times, good times, and bad times, the idea that Russia was always going to be a critical neighbor, and that managing the German-Russian relationship was central to keeping a degree of stability and crisis management in Europe. That is the story. That is a critical part of the strategic culture of Germans. And you now have a generation of Germans who came of age in a time of remarkable peace in their country, right? Where born in the 1980s, at a time where West Germans in particular were going through big debates about whether nuclear weapons would keep them more secure, whether the American presence was good for them or bad, whether they wanted to live alongside American weapons and American troops. And then that decade had such dramatic change that by 1989, right, you could envision something that seemed impossible just a few years earlier. And so it really was this strategic culture built around engagement and trade. And that's really hard to reverse overnight. And so you're seeing these really difficult questions of, did we miss all the signs, right? 2014, maybe we should have known better, right? We've talked so far about the war as though it started in February, but right, the idea that this really is just a renewed part of a war that has been going on since 2014. And so for Germans, I think a lot of sort of going back to the drawing board and going, did we actually make this possible, right? Did the solutions that we tried to create with the French in 2014, the Steinmeier formula, and then this is all caught up in domestic political culture in Germany also, with the SPD, the Social Democrats, in particular being deeply embedded in this. And so there's a whole bunch of different layers, but it means the conversation is really complex and very slow. And so all of that is background to say that the reason I think it is so time-consuming is, yes, Olaf Scholz can get up and pronounce the Zeitenwende, this huge sea change in German foreign policy, but it takes a long time to change the ship of state, right? For everybody in your domestic political orbit, your coalition partners to come around, for everybody to be on the same page. And so that's a place where allies to the east of Berlin really ratcheting up the pressure, and they're getting help from the United States to do it, right? Because it's easy to gloss over this, but when Poland says we're sending this material to Ukraine, or Denmark says we're sending these harpoons to Ukraine, they're doing it because the United States is telling them behind the scenes, we'll replace everything that you send to Ukraine. And so there is a piece there where US power and the sheer willingness to spend on military supplies is enabling a lot of the Eastern diplomacy as well.
Yeah, a lot of that wouldn't happen without the Mac film. I want to pick up on a point that you mentioned almost in passing, where the characterization of sort of the Germanys as the strong ones and the Polands as sort of the weak ones. And that kind of depends on what metrics we look at, right? Because, of course, economically, Germany is a much more significant player than Poland. But, I mean, has anyone looked at the Bundeswehr's force structure and readiness numbers lately? It's not impressive. They have a standing army, kind of. And it's a sedentary army. Which leads me to the second point I was going to make, which was that they spent 20 years having the opportunity to hone that military through combat experience in Afghanistan, and instead chose to put so many so-called national caveats on how German forces could be employed in Afghanistan that, with the exception of a very small sort of part of their special operations community, which has its own problems with far-right extremism, very little of the German military learned much, whereas the American military spent 20 hard years in Iraq and Afghanistan learning hard lessons about combat. But the Bundeswehr, compared to the Polish military, that's a much closer sort of balance than certainly the economic figures would indicate. So let's talk about nuclear weapons. So the first question, and I get the question a lot, could this escalate to become a nuclear war? And of course, the answer has to be yes, because you have a nuclear armed state involved, and so you can't sort of just foreclose that horrific eventuality. And it's for that reason that I think while the Biden administration was unwise to close doors beforehand, that it was right not to go through that door and use these types of support that they're providing to the Ukrainians now and facilitating from, as Susie said, other NATO member states to provide. But we always kind of talk about the nuclear use question in the abstract, right? And the thing about nuclear weapons is you actually have to point them at something. You can't just sort of say we're going to use a nuclear weapon. You have to target. You need a target package. And this is where I start really stumbling logically. What is the sensible target for nuclear use? And I think that you have basically 4 options, right? So first you have the demonstrative use, where you detonate probably over the Black Sea, somewhere away from population centers. Depending on the wind situation, maybe you have problems on land, but certainly the detonation is taking place on the Black Sea. And the idea there, the logic behind that choice would be to say, if you're Russia, we are super serious about this, and this is how serious we are. If I were in a position where I had to formulate a response to that, my first question would be, yeah, but you're not that serious, because you bombed an ocean. You bombed water. And the power of the demonstrative nuclear weapon, I think, is not a given, and it has a lot of possibility to backfire in a much more active American involvement because of the breaking of this nuclear taboo. And for the record, the Biden administration had said this about chemical weapons when there was talk about their potential use in the southeast of the country. So there's the demonstrative nuclear water scenario. You have and then I kind of would divide Ukraine into 3 sort of tranches going east to west. So the Far East use is a battlefield tactical use against a concentration of Ukrainian troops in the sort of salient that the Ukrainians have carved out. The Russians, the Soviets, spent a lot of the Cold War believing that they could fight through nuclear fallout. And I have read an enormous quantity of Soviet general staff publications, formerly highly classified, about how they could and would do this. The universal conclusion of everyone who was involved in that was that this was BS, and was from day one. And if you have looked at any of the logistical problems that the Russians are facing right now, rations, vehicle tires, I would not be very confident if I were a Russian soldier that my NBC suit was going to fare any better than any of that. So you then have to fight through fallout. That doesn't, I think, bode well. Then you have the kind of the central tranche of Ukraine. Maybe you go after Kyiv, for example. But if your goal is to subjugate a country, irradiating the capital city from which you presumably will choose to govern is not wise. And if your goal is to reach a diplomatic settlement, then killing all of the people in a position to do that and sell it to the Ukrainian people is similarly unwise. The most likely, which I still believe is highly unlikely, is the Western scenario, so the fourth of all 4, where you make a demonstrative strike, probably against some kind of Ukrainian military concentration in the West, that is then Ukraine's problem, right? If you say that the Russians don't want the whole country, the Western part is not the part they're going to take, They bequeath the aftermath, they bequeath the fallout, I guess, to a future Ukrainian state to be supported by, Western Europeans, the United States, Canada, in cleaning it up. That's kind of the most likely target package I can cook up in my head. I really struggle to make that make sense as a choice until you get to the point where, Ukrainian troops are crossing the Russian border and are moving on Russian cities, which I think it's pretty clear from what we're seeing already around Kharkiv, they're not doing. I think they know better than that. To recap, my sense is that, of course, you need to take this risk and threat seriously because Russia and the United States are the only nuclear-armed countries that have civilization extinguishing capabilities. It is very difficult for me to put it into a military context of actual use.
Do you want to talk about the books too?
I would just add on this that I think the biggest takeaway that I have from this is that we're really bad at understanding deterrence. Right? We think we know a lot about how the logic of nuclear weapons works. We think that we have a rich and robust theory, thank goodness not much practice, about how nuclear use works. And this is a really good time to go back as academics and think about why we have such a degree of confidence that we know what we know about things that have never happened. And that ideally we would like to keep from never happening, right? But there are a lot of people who go out and talk with confidence. Putin is going to fire a nuclear weapon if X, Y, and Z conditions are met. I don't know, how do you know? Vladimir Putin probably doesn't know, let alone you, right? So how do we know that, something is going to actually deter our adversary? Is it doing more to deter ourselves, right? We've heard a lot of talk about self-deterrence. If we go back to the German case, right, one of the lines that Olaf Scholz's office used about not wanting to send tanks and other military support to the Ukrainians was about not wanting to cause a nuclear World War III, right? And so, for good reason, people are terrified of nuclear weapons, right? Any person who thinks about them for any period of time should be terrified. If you're not, I have many questions. But thinking realistically through how we know what we know and why we have any confidence that we know what we know, when it's theoretical, is something I think is really the sort of critical takeaway for me is coming back to, why do we have 90% degree of confidence that deterrence will work this way? And in some ways, this conflict has been a very good reminder because you've seen some of the earliest theorizing about what nuclear weapons would do to international politics play out. So any student of early nuclear theory, you might recognize the stability-instability paradox, right? That part of the reason Ukraine was an appealing target or made possible or the threats were not as high for Russia to invade is that it was very clearly outside the sphere where nuclear protection applied. And so if we take old 1950s theorizing, Basil Little Hart, these kind of ideas, right, you have that, there's stability between the superpowers and then instability at a lower level of conflict. Well, welcome to the lower level of conflict. It's Ukraine right now. And so going back to thinking about how much of the old classics hold true, and how much they don't, is where I really think there's a lot of work to be done on the scholarly side.
I think this is a good time to turn to you and collect questions from our quality audience. Okay, we'll just repeat the questions so people at home can hear us. Yes, and you can introduce yourself if you want.
Hi, I'm Yogi. So I have one question for each of the things that you said earlier during this panel. Regarding Finland and Sweden joining NATO, on the one hand, I completely agree that it was a surprising change of centuries in the case of Sweden and less in the case of Finland. But I wonder, especially in the case of Finland, whether it's actually an opportunity seized rather than a complete transformative change, because there were some, first of all, debates in the presidential election back then, and also preparations for some membership. So maybe rather than, oh my God, there's a security situation changed, out of fear we'll join NATO together with Sweden, or was it, oh, there's an opportunity to already join NATO? Basically, how much change or continuity we have in this. And so should I repeat the question? Should I continue?
We can repeat the question in our answers.
Okay. And regarding, especially I'm trying to pick your brain of knowledge of inside Russia, the concept of the near abroad was not trivial once the Soviet collapsed and there was domestic debates regarding this concept. And I wonder, after all these years, and after this such personalistic regime, whether there are identity proposals or discourses alternative coming back to sort of, okay, let's go back with the concept and sort of detach ourselves or distance ourselves from this near abroad, dangerous beach diaspora.
So on the issue of the idea of the near abroad, which was the question within Russia, it's very telling, apropos of that foreign intelligence in all of the former Soviet republics is housed in the domestic intelligence agency of the Russian Federation. Right? So the FSB is the domestic intelligence agency, the SVR is the foreign intelligence agency. FSB intel runs Ukraine, runs Kazakhstan, runs the Baltic states. That tells you, I think, what you need to know. Again, going back to the point about force, tell me your force structure and I'll tell you who you are. That tells me a lot that the choice is made there. I think this idea of near abroad is suffusing this entire conflict. And I think it's important to say very clearly that a lot of the things that Putin has said about Ukraine and Russia being one country and Ukrainians and Russia, these are not fringe views. Very normal, reasonable people in Russia will tell you these things. There was a big kerfuffle in Canada when the brief leader of the Liberal Party of Canada, who's a man named Michael Ignatieff, said that he believes that Ukrainians are little Russians. This was an interview from hell. He also allowed the interviewer to refer to him as Count Michael Ignatieff, which, while technically correct, is not a good look for the leader of a left of center social democratic party. So I think, and this is my speculation to go to your question, that there is going to need to be a reckoning with this idea, as you say, but I don't think anyone wants to do it. I don't think anyone in the Russian government wants to do it because that sort of fungible empire idea is very appealing. And I think very few people in Russian society want to do it because what we're looking at and what mobilizes Putin's supporters is in many ways this kind of Cold War, Soviet nostalgia. Not for communism, but for something bigger and better, which, especially given what happened in the 1990s, was taken away quite spectacularly from them.
Yeah, so on this question of, here we go. Okay, on this question of how much Finland and Sweden bidding to join NATO is continuity or change, I think this is the central paradox of this story of Finland and Sweden asking for membership. Because on one hand, it is a story of remarkable and incredible change, right? I mean, doubling the border of NATO with Russia has huge geopolitical consequences. Big changes in both countries' foreign policy traditions. But on the other hand, it's not as if on February 23rd, before Putin decided to expand the war in Ukraine, he was sitting around going, Sweden is going to be my next new ally. Or Finland, Helsinki, they're really going to be on my team. I mean, they knew that Sweden and Finland were already in active cooperation, deep ties to NATO, and for at least 15 years, right, had both Finland and Sweden have been referred to as sort of informal NATO allies, people leaning really heavily on the rhetoric, splitting rhetorical hairs between partners and allies. Big deal for international relations people, not a big deal for readers at home, right? But But this idea, so in some ways it's just continuity. That is a story of continuity. I think in terms of this question of whether it was seizing and opening, there is a really interesting, I don't know if I have a good answer for this yet, but I will be interested to see as we get more interviews and backstory about this, whether the story in one or both of Finland and Sweden is in part about seizing this perfect moment, right? That finally in domestic political landscapes where it has been thorny to make the case for NATO membership, and you saw dramatic spikes in public approval, right? 15-20% bumps in the polls for membership, that they seized this moment and said, yeah, this is it. We're going to fully occupy this space. The other potential argument that kind of fits with that as seeing it as opportunity is that it's a very good way to signal to Vladimir Putin, yet again, how much of a disaster this has been, right? To say, look, this is a way to telegraph to anyone, even people who are very unfamiliar with the specifics of this. You convert a country that has been neutral or not militarily non-aligned for 200 years into a NATO ally when your justification for war was, I don't want NATO to get any closer to my borders. It's a pretty strong and unmistakable signal that Putin has not gotten what he has wanted out of this war. But it does raise, I think, some interesting medium-term questions for NATO, because they, so many of the allied policymakers, from Jens Stoltenberg, the Secretary General, down, have really embraced this as a sign of the open door and a continued commitment to open, that anyone who wants to be a member of NATO in the Euro-Atlantic space can apply to be a member of NATO. Well, can Ukraine be a member of NATO? Can Georgia be a member of NATO? And I don't know if there are cut and dry answers to those questions, but they are some of the thorniest and most difficult questions of the European security order dating back to 1989 and 1990. And so this, obviously much of that depends on what the solution in Ukraine ends up looking like diplomatically on the ground, but it has made that question a lot more ambiguous than I think it was in February.
Oh, we're just going to more questions.
Yes, you got it.
No,
Oh,
that's it.
sorry.
No, because I wanted to say it to Ivan.
So, question by me, but also I have a question from a friend at home. So, this is a good question. So, first question is, why 2022? I mean, what happened now? Because that's one of the things I can't figure it out so far. Between 2014 and now, sometimes it's changed, sometimes it's passed, and it didn't seem like there's something that. And then the second question regards to Germany, and the question for home is, when do you think that the concern of European powers has shifted from Germany getting too strong to Germany isn't being militaristic enough?
Yeah.
That's just what you're saying.
Yeah, so on this question of Germany and when the concern has shifted, right, from the sort of old concerns of so much of the post-1945 order, right, trying to keep the Germans down, to now the Germans not being up enough, maybe, on the military side. I think this is really a place where we're seeing generational change, right, that 1945 is now multiple generations ago, and you do not have the same generational sense of Germany's place in the world and in the European order, and increasingly that is a subject for concern, right? And I think here, this is where I would bring in something that we haven't talked about, but maybe touches on your other question, which is that the United States is not necessarily a reliable partner anymore. And so part of, I think, the big anxiety about the future constellation of security in Europe is that it's all well and good that the Biden administration has been strong on this, that they have been vocal on this, that despite wanting to pay attention to China, they, took what came and said, look, we have to meet this head on, and we're going to be strong and telegraph, all the support we can telegraph. But Biden isn't president forever. He's not Vladimir Putin, right? And so he will be president until an election in 2024. And what if Donald Trump wins? What if someone like Donald Trump wins? I mean, there is not a broad consensus in the United States anymore that allies are a good thing. There's not a broad consensus in the United States anymore, particularly in the Republican Party, that Russia is someone who we should view as an adversary. And so I think some of this trepidation about Germany's orientation is what happens if in 2024 you have a second Trump term and he follows through with the threats that John Bolton said he would and he leaves NATO. And then all of the Central and Eastern Europeans are stuck in Europe with a Germany that doesn't really know what it's doing, France that talks a big game about strategic autonomy but hasn't really been able to get that off the ground in the last 30 years, a Britain that is still trying to figure out how to rebuild its economy after Brexit, and a Canada that is like, well, okay, I don't, like, how do we even relate to Europe anymore because the US is gone, right? And so that, I think a lot of the anxiety about Germany is coming from that place. The only thing I would say on 2022, why 2022, and I'll let Simon take this one, is two things. Donald Trump's gone, Angela Merkel's gone.
So my first, this appears to be totally out of commission. Oh, now it's working. Gosh, if you build it, the first part of my answer as to why 2022 is what she said. The second part of my answer I should preface with the best I can do for you is a hypothesis. I can't do an answer for you yet because we will know eventually, but this is, to me, this is kind of the big puzzle. I mean, there's a lot of much smaller micro puzzles, which are much more answerable, actually, but the why 2022 one. I think that there was a sense in the Russian sort of national security sector that the window of opportunity where they could defeat the Ukrainians militarily was closing because of the extensive military cooperation between the Ukrainian military and sort of the Western European militaries, the cycling of Ukrainian units through the major NATO training center in Grafenwöhr in Germany, and so on and so forth, was rebuilding not just Ukrainian technical capabilities, but also the culture of the Ukrainian military. A culture that is predicated on what I would describe as the Anglo-American military culture of empowered non-commissioned officers who are problem solvers at the very tip of the spear. I think there's a lot of evidence that that system wins wars really well. That system solves problems really well. That system cuts through the fog of war better than most. The Russian system of having to run everything up the flagpole, where you get generals at the very front lines, in many ways kind of reconnaissancing their own battlefields, gets you dead generals, which I welcome in this context, and does not get you the kind of military innovation that you need in modern warfare to generate speed, surprise, and violence of action. So I think there's the political aspect, absolutely. I think there was a sense, and to be clear, the Russians had a very warped view of the Ukrainian military. That's quite clear from how quickly they believed they were going to win this thing. They believed they were going to basically have it wrapped up in about a week. There was a sense that that window was closing and that further integration, cooperation with NATO, which I should stress, is a product of Vladimir Putin's brilliant strategy, right? This is a post-2014 story. There were tiny, negligible quantities of Ukrainians at these major NATO training centers before 2014. Now, the Ukrainians will take as many slots as you can give them, and more. Is sort of a big part of it as well, that there was a political window of opportunity, sort of a strategic window of opportunity, but also a military window of opportunity, which I think gives us some purchase on the why now, but I restate by way of conclusion that that's my hypothesis.
Dr. Orabinovich, and let me take this opportunity to thank you for initiating this wonderful conversation.
This is all her fault.
The only form of transportation I did not take to ride here is a chopper. Private car, heavy train, light train, and bus.
Awesome.
What do you think Israel should learn from the
I think all militaries are trying to work out what they can learn from this, right? And I think a few things are true. One, and I think this is something that the Israeli military understands quite well, is that urban warfare is and will always be a combined arms effort. I thought we had all kind of worked this out, but in case anyone needed a reminder, sending light infantry into urban centers with no heavier support ends in a bunch of dead light infantry, right? Basically, for the first week of the war, the Russians threw their elite infantry units, Spetsnaz, reconnaissance, naval infantry, into a meat grinder in Ukrainian cities. The tank, this is kind of point 1A, the tank actually still matters, and high tank ratios are actually really useful in fighting still modern warfare. And it is striking that we are still, I think, really need to rely on those tools and being able to fight off vehicles. Use vehicles as kind of mobile CPs is really important, because the Russians have totally botched the urban warfare kind of fight in this conflict. And they've basically forsworn it now, right? Like, they're barely defending cities. And if they had tried to go into Kyiv, a city I know fairly well, that city is a rabbit's warren. I don't know if anyone's been there. You've got, not only do you have an extensive metro system, but every single intersection is like a small shopping mall underneath, subterranean shopping mall. So that's point the first. Point the second is, just like tanks still matter, artillery matters. The beginning of this war, we saw a lot of great Twitter and YouTube content, and TikTok, I guess. I don't know if you're on TikTok. Congratulations, you've given the Chinese all of your private information. There was a lot of really good content about teams of Ukrainian soldiers, light soldiers with javelins and various weapons provided largely from the West. That made for a good information story. It did exploit the vulnerability of the T-72, which has very poor peripheral field of vision and very poor topside armor. But I think that in the years to come, we are going to tell that story differently, and it's going to be about Ukrainian artillery doing classic fires as opposed to kind of the sexy and cool javelin hits, though those mattered without a doubt. So I think part of the story, therefore, is that it's meet the new boss, same as the old boss. But I think that what any country's military is going to learn from this, and this is definitely going to be true of Israel, as I mentioned earlier about the defending forward issue and not being able to use space to buy time, is the enormous utility of drones and loitering munitions. The former is something we all have learned more and more and more about. The latter are a semi-new phenomenon on the battlefield, especially at scale. And the idea that you can lose platforms without losing personnel is, for a country which has a manpower issue, a really, really important one. The Ukrainians, we think, based on what we can see from wreckage photos and things like that, Ukrainians have basically lost their entire first complement of TB2s. The ones that are in the air now are all new. And yet they're still able to mount a really effective fight. And then the final point that I'll make is information matters and public opinion matters. And this goes to your point about the appetite for images of soldiers clashing with civilians. The Ukrainians are winning the information fight in such a one-sided way. It almost feels unfair, and I think that's intentional. And that is certainly something that they have tried to do. Maybe one last point I'll make is actually a question, which is, where is the much vaunted Russian electronic warfare and cyber warfare capability? They didn't come. I don't know what happened. But trying to answer that question is going to be really useful to think about, where we're going in terms of monitoring.
I'll just come. Let's see if I can make this work. I can't. Okay. Oh no.
Right.
Okay. I will just come back to build on a point that Simon made about information and the political side of public opinion, which is that this is not, despite every time something big happens, somebody will tell you this is the first time this has ever happened. I am a historian, I'm here to tell you this is not the first time a war has ever happened on social media, either in its current iteration or in the previous iterations of the precursors to social media. But what we are seeing is that the Ukrainians in particular have made the most of the rapid spread of information to make a very compelling and persuasive political case for why you should stand with Ukraine, right down to the hashtag stand with Ukraine. I mean, you look at a private enterprise like St. Javelin, the t-shirts, it's made $1 million, right? Just selling t-shirts and stickers that have gone entirely to the war effort in Ukraine. Now, I think there are two stories about the information war, such as there is one, which is that Ukraine is absolutely winning in the West, and that the story in the rest of the world is a very different and much more nuanced story. And that Russia knows where its comparative advantage is. They're not trying to convince, some person in New Jersey. They have harnessed their resources and focused them on the places where they think they can and will win this information contest. And Ukraine has chosen differently, right? So you do have a sort of stark division of the world. So I would caution against kind of the generalization that Ukraine is hands down winning. They're hands down winning from where we sit. But I think that the bigger question is, and here is where there's a really interesting sort of uncertainty, is how much of the Russian action that we're seeing today is going to open and reopen some of the biggest questions about how we enforce sovereignty, how we determine whose sovereignty is legitimate, how we prosecute crimes, particularly against civilians. So you've seen a lot of international law specialists talking about whether or not it's possible to have a tribunal, right, to hold Russian military forces and political leadership accountable for crimes against civilians. And these kinds of questions, right, how we come down on how broad public opinion sees atrocities against humans played out on their computer screens, their telephones at home, right, just scrolling through Twitter, and how they demand or don't demand political action in response to that. I think some of those, right, they're in a very fluid state right now, but how that settles is something that any government should be concerned about and thinking about what the future of bigger international legal and political regimes is going to look like.
Thank you very much. Well, our time is up. Just want to conclude with just one, to pick up on something you said before, just a plea to why it's important to study theory, but also history, and the importance of area studies that are so, I think, challenged, at least in our university setting. And you said something about how in the US today there are just very few people who actually studied Russia because there's no incentives. There was no incentive to study Russia. And I keep wondering, and we can't open this up now, how much of this, knowledge gap in terms of academia and then policy experts actually can make a real difference in terms of, understanding your rival, preempting all sorts of situations. I mean, that's a huge question. But I think it just shows how important it is to actually study a region, study states, and not only the United States, and in this case, even Russia, So I had to make this point. I want to thank you so much for this interesting discussion. Thank you for coming. I suspect we might have another follow-up next year and we'll still have the same problems around. But, thank you so much. Have a good evening and to be continued later.